So do you want to, Maria, do you want to set up where you want to stand?
Perfect.
Good morning, everyone, and you're most welcome to the SCoTENS webinar, All in This Together, Teacher Education and Social Justice. We're so pleased that you could all join us this morning. In fact, over 240 of you, virtually, from various locations in the Northern and Southern Hemisphere. Some of you may be wondering who or what is SCoTENS and what does it or they do? Following the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998 and as part of the broader peace dynamic that was gathering momentum on the island of Ireland at the time, SCoTENS, or the Standing Conference on Teacher Education, North and South, was established in 2003 to create a safe space where teacher educators, North and South, could come together and discuss issues of common interest and explore ways of cooperating closely together. SCoTENS has grown and expanded since then, and currently is a network of institutions and organisations with the responsibility for and an interest in teacher education, including colleges of education, education schools and departments from the universities and the institutes of technology, teaching councils, curriculum councils, education trade unions, education centres and associations representing principals on the island of Ireland. We believe SCoTENS is the only network of its kind operating across a contested border in the world. And please, if you know of another, do let us know. We would be most interested in making contact with them. I'm Maria Campbell. I'm from St Angela's College, Sligo, and currently I'm the Southern co-chair of the SCoTENS Committee. And my colleague, Dr. Gabrielle Laguerre, from St Mary's University College, Belfast, who you'll meet after the break and who will introduce the second half of the webinar, is the Northern co-chair. You will get to meet many other committee members today who will introduce themselves to you, while you won't get to meet all, as some of my colleagues are working very hard behind the scenes or focusing on other events, such as the doctoral workshop this evening and other upcoming events. So what does SCoTENS do? Since 2003, SCoTENS has organised 3 initiatives each year. The annual conference, which we're doing today virtually, normally a 2-day conference, which endeavours to support teachers, the teacher education and the wider education community by inviting educational experts, both national and international, to deliver keynote addresses, facilitating workshops and the sharing of ideas, hosting a doctoral workshop and, importantly, providing a space for networking and collaboration across all sectors of the educational community, north and south. A second annual initiative is the Seed Funding Programme, which funds a wide range of research-based initiatives with a view to establishing sustainable north-south partnerships and projects. And SCoTENS has funded 127 such projects since 2003. SCoTENS also operates an annual North-South Student-Teacher Exchange programme, where student teachers from the South carry out an assessed school placement in the North, and students from the North carry out an assessed school placement in the South. Over the past 17 years, over 250 student teachers have taken part in this programme. As a result of COVID, we have and we are modifying this programme to include a virtual and a face-to-face experience this year. Alongside our annual initiatives, SCoTENS engages in a number of other events and projects. And this year, SCoTENS was delighted to partner with the Irish Government's Shared Island Initiative to issue a funded call for research for 2021-2022. The Shared Island Initiative was launched by An Taoiseach Micheál Martin in October 2020, with a view to enhancing cooperation, connection and mutual understanding on the island. The call placed a focus on 2 themes: educational underachievement, enhancing educational attainment, sharing experience and learning on a shared island, and teaching and learning, how we teach, acknowledging, understanding and learning from others on a shared island. The closing date was actually yesterday, and funding of up to 25,000 will be awarded to up to 4 projects. SCoTENS' website offers teachers and teacher educators a range of resources, and the committee continues to promote and advance the work of SCoTENS on the island and internationally through reaching out and developing links with governmental, policy and professional bodies with a similar interest in the promotion of quality education for all. SCoTENS could not operate without the support of our funders, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Department of Education and Skills in Dublin and the Department of Education Northern Ireland for their continued support and for providing funding to SCoTENS to enable us to carry out all the work I've outlined for you. I would also like to thank the recently established Department of Further and Higher Education, Research and Innovation and Science, who have provided financial support to SCoTENS this year. And I would like to thank most sincerely our member organisations and institutions for their continued support, and in particular in these difficult times for continuing to provide funding. Please be assured we are most appreciative of this, and we are aware of the many financial constraints that organisations and institutions are under. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to the programme for this morning. This year we are delighted to announce that Minister Norma Foley, Minister for Education, was due to join us from Dublin to open the seminar this morning. Unfortunately, we are having some technical difficulties, so Minister Foley's speech isn't available for us now, but we'll be showing it at a later stage during the webinar. We are most appreciative of the continued support of the Department of Education and for Minister Foley, and by agreeing to open the conference, acknowledging the commitment to quality teaching and learning for all on the island that SCoTENS has been committed to for years. So, in the absence of that opening speech, I will introduce our keynote speaker, Emeritus Professor of Sociology of Education, Professor Stephen Ball, University College London, Institution of Education. And following Stephen's keynote address, both Professor Linda Clark, Professor of Education, Ulster University, who's here with me at the moment, and I will facilitate a Q&A session. And then at 11:30, we'll take a 15-minute break. So now I will move on to the introduction to our keynote speaker, Professor Stephen Ball. Stephen, delighted to see you in the room with me, even though it's not live, albeit virtually. I just had a few words that I'd love to say before we actually have our opening conversation. As my colleagues asked me to introduce Stephen Ball today, I had as one reference point the vast arrays of commentaries and commendations and tributes to the extensive contributions Stephen has made to the field of education policies by developing resources and tools, many of which are informed by the work and methods of Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu. These critical resources and tools allow an understanding of the wider societal context within which policies are conceived and produced, and the consequences and impact of competing societal interests on policy development and policy enactment. Stephen has been described as one of the most eminent scholars in the field of education policy by Maynard et al. In 2009. Indeed, Michael Apple in 2013 indicated that one of the things that sets Stephen Ball apart from many others is his insistence that both structural and post-structural theories and analysis are necessary for bearing witness and for an adequate critical understanding of education realities. The esteem in which Stephen and his work is clearly held is reflected in the list of positions he holds and has held and the awards he has received over the past 40 years, including his election as Fellow of the British Academy in 2006, his appointment to the Karl Mannheim Chair of Sociology of Education at the University College London Institute of Education, his honorary doctorates from the Universities of Turku, Finland and Leicester. He's a Fellow of the Society of Educational Studies and a Laureate of Kappa Delphi, co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Education and Policy, and the list goes on. Stephen's list of publications is also extensive, including over 140 articles and 20 books, with the 4th edition of the Education Debate published this autumn. Stephen's creativity extends to the world of fiction, with 2 detective stories published on Amazon and entitled, a little worrying for some of us, The Death of an External Examiner and Death in the Ivory Tower, with the 3rd book just completed. More recently, Stephen has been researching the digitalisation of education with 3 recently published articles which explore how digital platforms change what education is and how it's experienced, the enactment of blended learning and its effects on education, and the relationship between neoliberalisation and the increasing use of digital technologies in school classrooms. A second point of reference was my extremely limited but highly memorable first encounter with Stephen during my doctoral studies at the then Institute of Education. Stephen, you gave a workshop to us as first-year doctoral students, and my lasting memory was of the creative nature of the concepts you introduced us to, and the multifaceted and multi-layered character of the content of your discussions and the threads you subsequently wove. But most importantly, my lasting memory was of your effort at connecting with us as early-stage researchers and enabling us to expand our thinking and to connect with that theory-practice thread. I'm sure, as is the case with many of our attendees today, Stephen, your texts populate the reading lists of my modules, and I can always be sure that your ideas and concepts capture the imagination of the students and provide the stimulus for robust and reflective discussions and really creative outputs. With that in mind, I'm so looking forward to your address this morning entitled Against School, Creating a Space in Which to Think Education Differently. And I'm looking forward to being challenged to question and examine many of my preconceived ideas and constructs and the connections I make and have failed to make in the past. My third and final point of reference was you, Stephen. I had asked you if there was anything in particular you'd like me to say about you. And in doing so, I'm going to finish with your words, which captures all I've been trying to say, but does so succinctly and with such humility. So, to quote Stephen, I have been researching and writing about education for over 40 years. teaching teachers for over 40 years, using theory to provide tools for teachers and for me to think with. And with that, Stephen, we're absolutely delighted that you're joining us here today, and I'm going to sit down and enjoy listening to everything you have to share with us. Stephen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I hope what I'm going to say does turn out to be enjoyable. That remains to be seen. What I want to do today, the point of my presentation is to challenge you. And in doing that, I recognize that I may annoy or upset or outrage you. And that's a necessary risk, and an important risk. I don't intend to mince my words, to condescend, to patronize. I want to try to make it impossible not to think, not to question, and not to doubt. And I want to say that I'm drawing in part on some work that I've done with a Catalan colleague, Jordi Collet-Sabay. I'm very grateful to him for enabling me to think better about education. The conference preamble has a series of questions, the first of which asks, how can teachers, teacher educators, and education leaders be both educators and advocates of social justice? And essentially, that is the question that I want to address today. And the premise and the argument underpinning my presentation is a very simple one. And that is that if we want to bring about an educational experience that is socially just and contributes positively to social justice, we must begin to think about education without the school. We have to start to think beyond, or indeed against, the school. If we care about social justice, and indeed if we care about education, we must accept that the school is an intolerable institution and that it is irredeemable. And yet, to all intents and purposes, when we now think about education, we think about the school and schooling. Education and the school have become totally fused when we think, talk, and practice what it means to be educated. And my argument is that we need to separate out education and the school. The problem underlying this is that we misread and misunderstand the school and its role and purpose in modern society. The school is a quintessential institution of modern industrial society that came into existence with the purpose of managing the population, alongside other such institutions like the barracks, the prison, the welfare office. And it was brought about to produce a docile and productive workforce. So contrary to the sensibilities of educational research and education policy that look for more and or better schooling as a way of making education more equal and socially just, my point here is that the modern European school is by definition and purpose an institution of division, categorization, allocation, and exclusion, within which equality and social justice are always fundamentally impossible. Nonetheless, the dominant trajectory of educational criticism and the focus of the bulk of critical educational activity does not begin from whether education is compatible with schooling, but rather most of the time simply asks what kind of school is best. And this dominant and decadent mode of criticism operates primarily within an instrumental perspective rather than a substantive one. The major arguments put in relation to schooling and its effects and consequences are not based on questioning its existence. It's not based on substantive or moral questions, but from various technical and ideological perspectives, it focuses on the estimation of advantages and disadvantages, inequalities and exclusions from an instrumental or calculative point of view. We are therefore satisfied and at the same time disappointed by a school that is good enough for some, or even for most, but which above all in our thinking is necessary. In this view of things, inequalities and exclusions are seen as the untoward side effects of an institution that simply requires technical reform, concrete improvement, more rational forms of organization in order to be better or to be more effective. The school as an institution is taken to be the sensible and necessary building block of modern life, and one that is badly designed and processually unfair. It just needs to be reformed. However, in retrospect, many of these so-called reforms of schooling since the introduction of schools in the 19th century that were intended to help achieve a more inclusive, just and equal education would appear to have had little effect, or in some cases perverse effects, actually producing more or different new kinds of inequalities of access or treatment or outcome or resources, and in the process perpetuating forms of symbolic violence. The moral and radical critique of education has been displaced by a discourse of equity and social justice that rests on a taken for granted point of departure, which is that school is unquestionably good and or necessary and the best and proper site for the education of children. This redemptive discourse of school improvement, school reform, school change, school innovation is indicative of, or perhaps responsible for, the lack of attention given to other possibilities for educating that do not begin with the school. Other ways of socializing children, other ways of being human, other ways of relating to ourselves and to others. So the history of the failure of school reform becomes the failure to open up deeper questions, like what education means today and what it is for, and what it might mean if we were to think about education without the hindrance and necessity of the school. One of the consequences of the failure to open up substantive questions about the school for researchers and social and political movements seeking to reform or improve education is then the submission to a constant cycle of hope and despair, of progress and defeat, of challenge and incorporation. As educational researchers, as practitioners within the European Enlightenment tradition, with few exceptions, we find it impossible to walk away, to admit defeat and move on. There is always more hope to be had, new possibilities of reform to explore. So despite constant criticism, but despite continued reform failure, a vague romantic impulse remains, which just about sustains the educator, which just about fends off the shift into cynicism. And this impulse is the product of a belief that despite it all, despite everything, education is still motivated by an essential goodness. I assert that this belief and the hope it sustains are misguided. The problem is not with the ambitions of goodness, but its vehicle, the school and schooling as the default signifiers of education. The project of social justice and of reform thus misunderstands the school as a site of opportunity and possibility, and we are always disappointed. We forget, ignore, or avoid the fact that the essence and the raison d'etre of the school is normalization and categorization. That As a result, education as currently conceived and represented by the school, as far as social justice is concerned, is a lost cause. Despite the debates around segregation, inequality, exclusion, despite or perhaps because of innovation, what is sought and desired and struggled for in movements of school reform of virtually all sorts is not something different, but rather is another version of the same thing, using the same architecture and paraphernalia that provide for and deliver in old and new ways division, exclusion, normalization, and categorization. Thus, I take the school to be both intolerable and irredeemable. To be clear, this is not just simply addressed to the bad school or the neoliberal school or the unequal school or the failing school or the excluding school, but to the epistemology of the modern school to court and the conditions of possibility that produce it. Rather than its organizational form or mode of delivery, what I want to focus on is its epistemic bases from which the school emerged, was consolidated, and on which it still operates. These constitute forms of productive violence that act upon our subjectivity as learners and teachers, our relation to ourselves, and our possibilities of self-recognition, how we know and understand ourselves. I understand the difficulties involved in writing, and I would assume, and I found on other occasions of listening to such statements, these difficulties are very telling in themselves. The school is deeply ingrained in our modern psyche as necessary and inevitable. Saving the school is, for many practitioners, researchers, and writers on education, their vocation, their project, their purpose. But I want to argue for the discarding of that purpose and suggest instead that school is one node in a network of intolerable institutions, part of the carceral archipelago of modern society, and requires therefore our opposition rather than our support. The point here is that the school is not as necessary as all that. Indeed, it is a block, an obstacle, an inhibition to freedom, to social justice, and to learning. The school is one of the major institutional sites of our social intelligibility. It provides a language, a method, and a system of representation that constructs particular regimes of truth about who we are and who we might become. That is, it constitutes the terms in which self-recognition is possible. And it preempts our subjective possibilities, closes them down. Our relation to ourselves and others are in part, therefore, only realizable in its esoteric discursive currency as qualifications, categorizations, performances of various kinds. We are located, evaluated, labeled, and in entanglement of physical, cultural, cognitive, and emotional elements that the practices of the school enable. This is the framework for experience and social relations within which we learn and within which we learn what learning is. The school, together with other cognate institutions, makes us natural, objective, transparent in social and political terms. Key aspects of our singularity are produced through processes of constant aggregation, sorting, and comparison. The school is a particular site, a point of concatenation at which the student and teacher as subjects are concentrated and enacted through patterns and clusters and models. We call them things like levels, sets, streams, bands, specialisms, withdrawal units. The school hails and labels us, and we must respond as a social entity if we are to be recognizable socially. As a learner, as a social fact, we become a competence, a level, a qualification, a score, and an achievement. Given all that, what are we then to do? In order to move on, to fail better, we need to violate the claim that school embodies universality, both as this pertains to the structure of reason and the truths of human nature. In other words, we need to address the school as a question that remains for us to consider. So let me unpack a little more carefully the epistemology of the modern school. And what I mean by that is its grammar, the assumptions and premises and truths on which it rests, the self-evidence of the school. And I think we can identify 6 elements to this epistemology, although these are not mutually exclusive, they're interwoven and overlap in various ways. So there's the school as a site of government, the school as a site for the articulation of the norm, the school as an enactment of the universal, the school as a site of categorization and division, the school as a site of the processing of individualism, and the school as a site of expertise. And I want to talk briefly through each of these and give an indication of the assumptions embedded within them, which then form what it is that we understand by the idea of the school. And I begin with the school as a site of government. Once government was conceived in terms of the optimal management of a particular territory, a country, and its population in the 18th century, the politics of schooling brought into existence a set of institutional practices as a means for the moral training of the population with a view to enhancing the strength and prosperity of the state and thereby the welfare of the people. That is, the origins and rationale of modern schooling and its pastoral disciplinarity procedures are the production of nation-state subjects, productive and useful workers, moral and responsible Christians, a moral orthopedics, as Roger Deacon nicely puts it. Schooling taught not only punctuation, but also punctuality. It taught not only reading, but also hygiene. It taught that learning should not only entail gratification, but also requires chastisement. We misread the school if we attempt to reconcile it with socially radical concepts like social justice, equality, critical thinking, solidarity, or self-flourishment, and thereby lies our disappointment. The school is a site for the articulation of the norm. School enacts and stands for a clear separation of society and nature, civilization and chaos, reasoning and emotion, childhood and adulthood. It provides a transition. That is, a set of boundaries and binaries are underpinning the school that circumscribe the form, purposes, and modalities of education. One of the tenets of the modern school was to create a clear distinction between light and shadow, civilization and barbarity, infancy and adulthood. The project of schooling was to transform the young from a state of nature, of untamed childhood, to a state of culture as an assiduous pupil. That is, a move from the magical to the rational, from the enfant sauvage to the reasonable and reasoning learner. And this is a system of divisions established around the clarity and power, in particular, of the norm, and in relation, therefore, to the abnormal. And the word normal, as Ian Hacking writes, uses a power as old as Aristotle to bridge the fact-value distinction, whispering in our ear that what is normal is also right. Obviously, if there is a normality, a right way of being enacting, there must also be a non-normality, a bad morality. And in school terms, normality is intertwined with success and failure with abnormality. Failure, as attributed to both pupils and families, is not just a matter of ignorance or poor performance, it is a moral failure. And the school as the enactment of the universal. The school episteme works from and reproduces a set of universals that articulate and normalize one way of being. In the contemporary school, one overbearing and very specific version of the universal, currently dominant or in play, is male, white, Western, heterosexual, middle class, being without special needs or requirements. The intersection of these different normativities may be a point of privilege for some, it is a point of abjection for others. From this basis, from this basis of universality, the modern school episteme ignores or excludes or stigmatizes other possibilities of being, of culture, class, gender, and sexuality, capability. The deep roots of the universal, as a defining characteristic of the modern school, prefaces the continuing exclusion and rejection of other kinds of human bonds, needs, attachments. And it delimits and polices the field of what we consider to be valid experience and identity. These universals are then anthropological. That is to say, the school proposes an exclusive recognition of the rational subject through the definition of, although the definition of rationality, what we consider to be rationality, may change over time. And that form which is currently predominant or hegemonic is that of the improving, competitive, self-interested creature that we can call Homo economicus. The school, over and against this, the school experience for those who fail, those with behavioral difficulties, those who are hard to reach, those who lack character or resilience or aspiration or have the wrong kind of parenting, have special needs, is essentially the experience of not truly or properly being human. In the past and in different ways now, those who are deemed as not properly human are exposed to the dark side of the school experience: punishment, exclusion, abuse, assimilation, shame, civilization, evoked by the failure to fit within the school universal. The hidden curriculum of schooling is made up of those truths that speak about what being a normal human is. And the school is a site of categorization and division. The modern school is above all a place where inequalities are verified. It's not a place where they're challenged or reduced. The modern school operates as a site for the description of groups and the characterization of collective facts, the calculation of gaps between individuals and their distribution within a given population. And these categories and programs feed the proliferation of subjectifying discourses in which the truth of individual is produced. And it is the creation of universally objective social categories in relation to this distribution that legitimates various treatment programs of intervention for those who fall within or fall outside of certain of their boundaries. These categories and programs feed the proliferation of subjectifying discourses in which the truth of the individual is produced. There is nothing covert or mysterious about these techniques. They are built upon and into the very structure and routine of the school. Learners are seen, they're modified and broken down by age and sometimes by gender, by ability, by need, in relation to the identification of talents or capabilities or forms of speciality or abnormality. In these terms, the school is quintessentially a disciplinary institution, which through the organization and division of space and time and the concomitant organization and division of learners formed a key part of the new urban landscape in the late 18th and 19th centuries as a constituent of the urban grid of power. And so it remains. Indeed, the very idea of the school, its materiality, its imagery, its articulation within policy and practice, has come to be centered on and enacted in terms of a machinery of differentiation and classification. In many ways, now more than ever before, school is reduced and represented in terms of sets of performances. We understand what it means to be educated in these terms. The school is also a site for the processing of individualism. There was the appearance of specific modes of individualization as part of the shift in the mode of government rationality around the end of the 18th century. At this time, social truths were no longer being related to a family or a community, but to isolated individuals. It was at this point that the school became a key technology in the production of these individual subjects, en masse as a form of batch production, but an agglomeration of individuals known in terms of their individual identity, capability, normality. And again, the school was one site among many for the management of the population in this way, and the regulation of the population as a multiplicity of individuals. So the modern school came to be about the practical production of humans as cognitive individuals and individual subjects rather than as relational subjects. The school is about the creation of a space or a gap between ourselves and others. And the individual became the basic, taken for granted and irreducible unity of social life. The individual emerged as a key constituent of what we understand as society, and government and the procedures and architectures, technologies of the school made their specific contribution to this. The school indeed offers a precise and effective set of conditions and contexts within which individuals are produced and made up, and within which the individual subject is a reality fabricated by discipline. But the school is also a site of expertise. In the infrastructure and practices of the modern school, the task and duty of education is entrusted to professionals with specific techniques and with a certified legitimacy as teachers or pedagogues or psychologists, leaders. And such expertise consists of specific intelligible techniques for rendering pupils, students, thinkable and practical, and constituting domains that are made amenable or not amenable to particular reformatory interventions. This expertise enacts versions of the science of the state, and they are set over and against other forms of unprofessional knowledge, the forms of knowledge held by parents and communities. And these other forms of knowledge are rendered immaterial in a double sense. These other knowledges are filtered out, and in the process, the student, as an object of knowledge, is reduced to what is educationally relevant. Professional knowledges and their technologies are productive and critical in relation to a subordinate productive learner subject. And these professional knowledges work to bring about an essentialized subject of ignorance, a student who needs to be taught, a residualized subject made meaningful only in relation to the teacher and to teaching. And in these regimes of practice, the work done by scientific knowledges and done by the dividing practices that are inherent within them constantly carve out new objects of power: the student, the pupil, those with behavioral difficulties, the excluded. The professional gaze and its arts of seeing render the student as a category or a type. The pedagogical gaze desocializes and objectifies the student as a cognitive entity who can only be properly understood within a certain kind of expertise. So, given all this, to continue to hope for a school that is truly durable and truly and durably equal or socially just, is to ignore the epistemic foundations of the school as an institution, as a node in the disciplinary web of population management. Rather, we should look for an end to the modern school, look beyond the school, and in a certain way, look to our own end as modern educationalist subjects and refuse what we are. Only and through that refusal can we begin to think ourselves and our social relations differently. That is to say, we should give up on hope, accept that the modern school is intolerable, and move on. Reform is not the possibility of a new start, but rather typically an intensification of power. Reform is indeed a key trope of social regulation, both in maintaining our attachment to institutions, and frequently extending their scope and reach. Reform does nothing to change the deep structure of schooling, and our efforts to save the school by reforming it can only lead to a reiteration of despair. Whereas social justice is normally, and I would say paradoxically, articulated as the need for more school, I'm suggesting here that social justice only becomes possible if we have less school. What is needed here then is a form of critique that is radical, uncompromising, and non-reformist. A form of critique that refuses any attempt at arriving at a new disposition of the same arrangements of power. This requires us to undertake a reversal and a negative refusal. And the art of refusal here involves politicizing all aspects of the truth of the school and its consequences, and abnegating the self-evidence of the school, in order, therefore, to open up basic questions that can serve to both destabilize the modern school episteme and its particular forms and manifestations of power: pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment. and also to refuse the forms of self-interested individuality that school currently fosters. We must give up on all those orderly truths that have defined our purpose and our relation to and for education. We must seek a disengagement from and a renunciation of our intelligible self and become willing to test and transgress the limits of what we're able to be. However, there is a further considerable difficulty here. What I'm arguing for is the creation of a space in which it is possible to think education differently, but without, as is usually expected, specifying in advance what that difference might be, what it might look like. So when I speak this way, I'm always confronted first and foremost by one question. That is, what is the alternative? Well, I do not have an alternative as such to propose in the normal sense of what is expected. The problem with the tyranny of alternatives is that they inevitably rest on and are constrained by the epistemological, conceptual, and linguistic resources of the here and now. They are different versions of the same. In particular here, the challenge is to think education without the conceptual paraphernalia of the school, without curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. Once we've swept away those epistemological necessities, the task is to think differently about education within the space that's then created. Not to anticipate or close down that space in advance, but to see it as an opportunity for experiment and for different kinds of failure. For myself, I would want to begin to think about that space, about education, as an ethical practice, as the cultivation of a set of agentic skills, as a theatre of subject creation, of new practices of the self, and of new kinds of social relations. Education in these terms would be a political and aesthetic project of self-formation, where self-formation is the active and engaged process based on questioning and learning from the immediate and the quodician, forming and testing at the same time, an exercise of oneself in the activity of thought. This is a commitment to fostering ethical learners with a healthy suspicion of the present, while at the same time being able to acknowledge their own fallibility. And the adoption of a critical stance that moves between experiments in living intended to recreate ourselves and the world. This has some parallels with John Dewey's sense of learning as a cooperative and collaborative activity centered upon experiential creative responses to contingent sets of relations to cope with uncertainty in a never-ending quest, as he put it. Learning becomes an exploration of limits, mapping, testing, and crossing them when possible. All of this means recognizing students as independent ethical beings capable of reflection and decision-making and of taking responsibility for their identity and their social relations, and at the same time, accepting the necessity of failure, of dissonance and conflict. And this we might think of as a kind of consequentialist pedagogy. In this, education and what we might call the teacher and what we might call pedagogy, if we need to use those terms, are articulated as the formation of moral subjectivity that gives priority to ethics rather than truth. Thus, within this, what is at stake is the production of a certain kind of experience, a reconfiguring of experience that we might name as education. In other words, this is the care both of the self and of others and the world. The work of the politics of the self, a continuous practice of introspection, which at the same time is attuned to a critique of the outside world and our relations, our social relations in the world. And some writing and action in relation to the climate change emergency are couched exactly in these terms. So Komatsu and Repellier, they say we need to radically rethink our starting assumptions about modern mass schooling, one rooted in the modernist Western paradigm, its epistemology, as I put it, and consider whether education is in fact a solution or a cause of the trouble we now face. It is clear that the earth does not need more educated consumers of knowledge, a mere refurbishment of the long-standing Western turned modern assumption that knowledge alone will allow us to reach the good life. Instead, we must first fundamentally change ways of being, then re-describe the world, including education in those terms. This then calls for what American writer Justin Infinito calls a political pedagogy. And she identifies three different aspects involved in working on oneself in this way that might be translated into educational practices. Although she goes on to say how these technologies are applied and what they might look like specifically in daily life or in the classroom are important questions that call for further theoretical analysis or practical application. But she does work through some practical applications. First, she suggests there is the fostering of a learning environment that encourages experimentation. And here the classroom becomes an ethical space, a political space, and a concrete space of freedom. Second, this would be based on enabling the development of an awareness of one's current condition as defined and constructed by a given culture and a given particular historical moment. Third, it is the encouraging of an attitude of critique with a focus on the production of particular sorts of dispositions that would be valued and fostered. Things like skepticism, detachment, outrage, intolerance, and tolerance. This would involve facilitating audacity and fearlessness and valuing difference as the basis of community. And these three aspects are, of course, interlinked. A learning environment that rests on self-formation is a condition for the possibility of refusal and the denaturalization of subjectivity, power, and truth. The classroom here is reconceived as a space of freedom. The curriculum becomes curiosity, and pedagogy becomes the fostering of agency and autonomy. The point here would be to encourage ethical teachers and learners who have a healthy suspicion of the present, but who are also able to acknowledge their own fallibility. This would be a space in which agonism would be valued and failure would be a constructive opportunity to learn more and to change, both of which take time. The pace of education would need to slow down. In such a space, it would also always be possible to start again. And who one is and what one thinks and what one is committed to in the world would remain tentative and always open to revision. In stark contrast to the modernist classroom, the concern is not with what is true, but with the how of truth. How do some things become regarded as true? So knowledge becomes a problem rather than a question. And above all, this is a classroom in which the aim is to cultivate the orientation to curiosity, a readiness to find what surrounds us strange and odd, a certain determination to throw off familiar ways of thought, and to look at the same things in a different way, a lack of respect for traditional hierarchies of what is important and fundamental. Curiosity is one means of loosening our relation to a fixed identity and creating the possibility of erring, moving away, of no longer being or doing or thinking what we are, do or think. And the learning processes involved here may be part of what Zembailes and others call the pedagogy of discomfort. That is, students and teachers are challenged to embrace their vulnerability and accept the ambiguity of self and their dependence on others. Part of the pedagogical challenge for the teacher is then to create a social and ethical environment within which discomfort is productive. Teaching becomes a process of asking questions without providing answers. The goal becomes to explore to what extent it might be possible to think differently. This is necessarily a very concrete and palpable experience and is the art of living dangerously. Emotions and intellectual risks and trust would become intermingled in complex and very difficult ways. And all of this begs many questions about how we get from where we are now to somewhere different. Wedded as we are to an education system that is patently absurd and divisive and that conflates education with schooling, the possibility of education as something different is obviously difficult to achieve. How do we move from an education that rests on the assumption of ignorance and a reverence to the past, and that can only function through practices of exclusion and humiliation, to a form of education that eschews system altogether and offers no privilege to the past, and rather consists of a process of creative self-fashioning, the opening up of vulnerability, unruly curiosity, and frank speaking? I have no simple answer to those questions, but this involves a task and a challenge that we might begin to address today, together. Thank you very much.
Oh, Stephen, wonderful, absolutely. Linda, I don't know your thoughts, but mine are. I said my brain is racing at the moment. Stephen, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I mean, you really, really raised so many issues there. I've just jotted down a few notes from that what struck me particularly from it. I loved that concept of how do we fix what is conceptually not sound to begin with. So therefore, if we focus on reform, we're bound to fail in a sense. And to give us some comfort in that, you know, coming out of that sentiment was the ambition for goodness, and that's true, that's good, and that's there. But it's just the vehicle with which we're trying to achieve that is what is flawed. So that kind of, for me, was very striking. The second thing that struck me particularly was that the focus on the school fostering individualism, the individual as individual, and particularly that success and failure of the individual is defined by the school, and that your failure is beyond, say, the academic, but it's also moral. You're failing as a human being, and that I really found so profound. And that in that sense, the school is actually, the individual is both shaped and defined in the school and measured from a set menu by which really some level of failure is inevitable. So that really I also found so profound. The third and I suppose final section for me then was going back to the question that you raised, you know, what's the alternative and how do we go forward? And for me, the thoughts were that, you know, school as we know it now and as it is constructed and conceptualised is such a significant cog in society. It is a huge and integral part of it. So that for me, as I was thinking about that, we currently see in that context education as a means to an end, as you say, an integral part of society. So therefore, for me, the question is, it's not just, and I don't belittle it by saying not just thinking about examining that concept of school, but it's more than that, looking at that in alignment with society, with the broader issues within it, the broader constructs, etc. within society. I think for me, doing one on its own, in a sense, is another source of potential failure because of the integral nature of it. So that's pretty much what I took from it. Linda, I don't know, had you any thoughts in relation to that as well?
Good morning, Stephen. That was very thought-provoking. Thank you very much indeed. As I understand it, in the UK, education is compulsory, but schooling is not compulsory. And during the pandemic, I suppose the space was opened where, on the one hand, we're seeing in the research we were doing that parents had a greater appreciation of teachers, perhaps in some cases because they saw them as babysitting so that they could get on with the homo economicus bit of their lives. But there was also at the same time an increase in homeschooling, although we don't have accurate statistics on that. We don't know how many children are homeschooled. We don't inspect those. We don't know if the children are enjoying or learning in those spaces at all. But do you see any space that's been generated by the changes in education, particularly those changes in the recognition of the role of teachers and the growth of homeschooling and blended learning and parents being forced into this role of homeschooling their children? Is there anything that's been opened up there that might allow us to move towards considering the ideas that you're challenging us with today?
The possibility of ed tech, of teaching and learning software, etc., education platforms of various kinds, have been posited as a different way forward.
Yes.
But if you look at the actual resources that were provided, certainly in England, I think in all of the UK constituencies, that they were essentially mimicking the school. Yes. They were mimicking a particular conception of curriculum, assessment and pedagogy, but through the medium of information technology, education technology. There are very few exceptions to that, I think. The platforms offered in the UK were those of Microsoft and Google. And one of the great outcomes of all of that was the signing up of hundreds of thousands of new account holders for Microsoft and Google, apart from anything else that might be achieved in terms of conventional learning. I think there may be some interesting things around the edges of all this. I saw a number of reports that talked about parents who became more and more committed to keeping their children away from school because they developed a stronger sense of the damage that school was doing to their children, particularly children with special needs and with disabilities. So perhaps for some people there were spaces in which they began to think about the possibility of education without school. But I think at the moment ed tech generally is not a source of something different. It's another version of the same. But one of the crucial aspects of it is that the power of decision making in some ways has shifted away from teachers towards code writers, animators, designers who now make decisions about pedagogy, curriculum, and to some extent assessment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I recognise that certainly. I also recognise so much of what you said in terms of a critique of schooling in the current, I suppose, the current marketised and increasingly marketised society. But teachers I know in schools and have known over my career often try to break the system. They often they recognise the limitations of what they're doing every single day. And they try to break the mould and try to have moral, ethical, critical classrooms. And I think there's hope in that, really. And SCoTENS is about teacher education primarily. And I wondered if you had thoughts, particularly in relation to this, in the role of teacher educators in this, Stephen.
Well, two thoughts about that. I mean, in terms of how you describe teachers, I think for the majority of teachers, that's right. They make the decision to become a teacher because they want to make the world a better place in general, and they want to support and help children individually and specifically. They have a commitment, a vocation, a purpose. But if you look at England at the moment, the situation is that we can't either recruit or keep teachers. And my account of that would be that, to a good extent, not exclusively, but to a good extent, the hemorrhaging of teachers from the profession is based upon their frustration about the impossibility of acting ethically in their schools, that they find themselves reduced to managers of performance. They find themselves constantly confronted with demands which lead to the prioritizing of certain children over others, to their use of time and attention in relation to what would be most effective in terms of the performance of the school, find themselves criticized if the performances in their classrooms are less than those in other comparable classrooms. And on that basis, if you look at the various research studies done over the last few years at why teachers leave the profession, that's what they talk about, that they can't be what it is they want to be. And I think that relates to what I'm saying. They are required to be something other than what it is that they want to be. They can't recognize themselves within the school. There's no space for, or little space for ethical practice. So we can't recruit our teachers, we can't keep our teachers, certainly in England. So the government yet again has introduced another bursary to boost the numbers of students going into teacher education. Yet another attempt to attract people instrumentally. I mean, I think it's massively indicative that the instrumentality of schooling is one of the key bases for not being able to recruit students. It's one of the key bases, teachers rather, one of the key bases for teachers leaving. It's one of the key bases of the practice of the school. So what do politicians, policymakers do? They introduce a new instrumentality. Let's offer more money in order to get teachers into school. And that's, I think, so symptomatic. It's just going down the wrong road. What politicians, policymakers need to do, it's very difficult to imagine them doing it at the current point in time, it is to look at what the school is and whether that is educationally defensible at all. We need an ethical audit of education. And I think that's where teacher education can play such an important part. It can be a site to resist a purely instrumental version of the teacher as the producer of performances, and rather to encourage, foster, develop, enable the development of an ethical form of identity and practice for teachers, to reinforce their teachers' sense of themselves as ethical subjects, as ethical practitioners. So I think teacher education, where it's able to do that, is of enormous importance.
Yes, and it's an enormous challenge to do that, to push against the mould for us in teacher education, because we are increasingly in a very highly restricted higher education system as well, in which the requirements of higher education and the inspection processes that are laid upon us really constrain us very much as well. So in terms of how policymakers react to these sorts of ideas, I mean, have you had a chance to throw this to the Michael Goves of the world and let them have a chew at it, or?
My experience is simply one of non-recognition, if you like, a non-engagement. It's regarded as not being sensible, and therefore you don't get a debate, an engagement. It's usually simply a retreat to the school. The response is, so what would we do without the school? We have the school, we need the school is necessary, that's all there is to it. There's no point or need to think differently about education. And even getting over the point that education and schooling may be different things, I think has become more and more difficult, particularly in the way that schooling and education have become fused together within performance. So that if one looks at any government policy now, it's always attached to goals in relation to raising performance. So performance becomes the be-all and end-all of everything. All government research money now is attached to achieving ends that will raise performance. So the situation of debate has actually become even more closed down, even more impossible in a sense. And we need therefore more and more sites at which and within which we can articulate these problems, articulate these questions, rather than dealing with education on the grounds that are established for us. Will this enhance performance? Will this make schools, will this improve schools? Will this make schools more effective? Mm-hmm. We need to go back, as I said, to actually raising questions about the school as a problem in itself. And the more and more sites in which we do that, then the looser perhaps the hold on the debate and the hold on the school might come. Mm-hmm. But the other problem I find is not simply talking to policymakers, it's actually talking to just about anybody else in education, that we are so committed to the idea of the school as an institution. I find it fascinating sometimes to watch the lengths that people will go to when I'm talking to them to defend the school. So I talk about exclusion and categorization, and I talk about damage to students, and it's, oh, yes, but we need the school. It has to be there. We can make it better. We failed before, but perhaps in the future we can do it better. And it's this cycle of hope and despair that I talk about. We won't give up. We always think there's more hope, and that's one of the things I'm trying to argue for is give up on hope. Let's not be hopeful. Let's simply be despairing and move on. Hope is dangerous. Hope is a very dangerous technology because hope keeps us committed to what we've got. Mm-hmm. We can make it better.
It is instinctual almost, though.
With hope. We can do something else. Yeah. Sorry.
It's an instinct almost, though, to continue to hope. And I think SCoTENS, one of the advantages of this organisation over its time is that we have had a space where we can bring in people to challenge us and to make us think. And we're going to have a debate then after the break where
that. And I might just even say to the audience as well, for participants and people listening, please, if you have questions, we have some of our colleagues in the back room, the green room as we call it. If you do pose your questions, they will attempt, technology all going well, to project them out here so we'll be able to see them and read them for you. And that, so if you do have questions, please do pose them. And hopefully, all going well, we'll get to see them here and be able to read them out to Stephen. But linked to that point you said, Stephen, about creating, shall we say, more spaces where we can open up that conversation. Again, going back to the theme, all in this together, for somebody who's been a teacher for years and been involved, say, in the schooling per se, you know, the role of parents, of all the other parties as well. How do we, if we are to create these uncomfortable conversations per se, how do we bring parents into that, to that kind of, to that zone in a way that will create a relatively safe space to have that uncomfortable conversation?
I think that there are very practical issues involved in that. We've never effectively created arenas, forums in which the parents' voice is welcomed and valued. There are sometimes formal events, parents' evenings, but they are very much pedagogical in a sense. It's the teacher standing for the school and the parent standing for the child. I think that the creation of things like study circles, as have existed in the past in places like Sweden, where key issues of school practice or education policy are actually debated and discussed by groups of parents who then write reports which are fed back to other arenas, can be ways in which people begin to get a sense that their voice is valued and welcomed. I think part of the problem is actually initially getting over the idea that anybody in education wants to hear what you have to say as a parent. But on the parents' part, I think there's also a problem that parents now, for the most part, see themselves as speaking for their child. Yes. So you're speaking up for your child, what your child needs, your child's problems. How can your child be served better? And this is a problem of the balance between equity and partiality, if you like. The extent to which we have a sense of the private good of our family and the public good, and that is getting a different balance between partiality and equity. I think is a task for schools. That schools should be reaching out to their communities and creating events and activities and spaces within which a different orientation to education is fostered. One in which parents are encouraged to speak about education more generally, not simply about their child. And so those are practical issues about the work one does, the arenas one creates. And I think that has to be done locally within communities. And of course, in England, that's become increasingly difficult because the government doesn't want to hear from parents or from communities. And it's actually outlawed, made illegal certain sorts of activities that parents as communities might engage in. Sorry, my telephone. I'll let it ring if I stop. So yeah, I think there are things to be done. I think there are things that schools can do, and they have an educative role again, which is beyond the simple production of performances. They have a role, I think, within communities, an educative role which is much broader, or should be much broader.
No, that is very interesting. And as you have said, Linda, too, from the SCoTENS perspective, again, as I said, what you've done today, you really have challenged me and genuinely to really, really think about things in a different way. But I suppose in a very simplistic way or a very watered down version of what you've said, we have attempted over the years to kind of foster that at least sharing and critique of each other's practices, where we've come together through be it different collaborative projects, etc., where we've shared, well, this is how we do it. This is our norm. This is our taken for granted norm. And say, okay, what do you do? And you share yours. And in a very small way, it actually opens up your eyes to somewhat, at times, slightly different ways of looking things, different conceptualizations, etc. But it's how to take that a step further. Because, say, your ask in a sense is, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, you're not really a 1 there. You know, how do you actually move that up higher? And have you any advice to us on things that we could do maybe to enhance the kind of the critique or the critical connections that we make there?
I think it's a very practical question that, and going back to what I said previously, that when there are moments or events or arenas within which educational issues or policy are being raised, rather than allowing those to become dominated by agendas which are being set elsewhere in terms of raising pupil performance or making schools more effective. In each of those, if a group or somebody or a group of people would stand up and say in the planning stage or the preparation stage, no, that's not what we want to talk about. We want to talk about this. We want to think about what it is, what kind of education we need in our current modern society. What kind of education do we need that will deal with, engage with the enormous social, economic, political, cultural problems we have in our society, rather than accepting your agenda, which is how do we improve school performance? In schools, in department meetings, in local arenas, on each of those occasions, if people are willing simply, I mean, it's not an enormously, in some ways, not an enormously challenging necessity, but it's stand up and say, we don't want to talk about that, we want to talk about this. I think that would be a starting point. To refuse the agenda as given, to not simply always talk on the landscape that has been created elsewhere and preempts anything else.
Okay, and that definitely is food for thought. Already I'm thinking of the potential, hopefully next year, if we have face-to-face, which we're hoping we will have, maybe the potential for a town hall scenario where, you know, lead from the floor. I'm just trying to think out loud of some kind of actual practical or tangible things we could actually be thinking of. And absolutely any and all advice from you would be really, really welcome over a 2-day event where you have people from all the various educational communities, I'll say for one. We don't have parental involvement. That isn't something that really has before.
No, we have to engage with that.
And
that's a bit of a challenge, yeah.
That is a challenge, yeah. That's
but
something.
we do have policymakers, and we do have teacher educators, and we do have teachers and student teachers indeed as well. So we look to the future too. So.
And the unions, we have the, you know, the teachers as represented by the union. So that is
yeah.
good. But again, do you have any other little nuggets for us? Little kind of pointers that might actually spark some, I suppose, creative thinking on our behalf that we could do?
Well, I think yourselves, I mean, teachers generally are in an excellent position to actually be able to say to various interlocutors, to politicians or civil servants, we want to talk to you about this. You are obviously important in the field of education and in determining what education is. Can we talk to you? Not about the latest initiative for raising performance, not about the latest set of regulations for control of COVID or whatever, not that those things are unimportant, but can we talk to you about what it is we're doing as an institution and what kind of educational experience we're giving to our students? Can we go back to basics? Can we not always ignore the basics and move on to things that have already been decided? Can we actually talk about what education is for? We are teachers, after all. Yeah. You're expecting us to work with our colleagues and work with students. Shouldn't we be able to talk to you, to participate in a discussion about what it is we are doing in a fundamental sense? In a sense that I don't, you may see that more or less as a more or less challenging task, but it's a very simple one, at least.
Often the best things in life are the simple things, Stephen, in some cases, and that. So we're just getting word that we're coming up to the end of the time, to our break time. So I just, from my own perspective, I would just like to say again, a huge thank you, Stephen. It really has been stimulating, and that we hear that there is a number of questions coming in, but there's a lag in that there. So we will have them. If you'd like us to share them with you, we'd be more than delighted to do that. But for ourselves as well, at a later stage, we really are looking forward to seeing them and to furthering this conversation in the second half. So we are going to finish up in the next moment or two, and then we'll take a 15-minute break. So I think we'll finish at 25 past, and that will allow us to take a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 22, and then hopefully we'll be hearing from the Minister at that stage then. But again, Stephen, on behalf of all of us, all the participants who were listening, on behalf of the SCoTENS Committee, we are so delighted that you agreed to speak today to us, and that you really challenged us. And my head is, I said, I may not sleep as well tonight as I thought I would, in a positive way after your conversation. But a huge thank you again. And hopefully, before too long, we actually might get to meet you in person.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. And my one particular hope is, as you are saying, that I have made it necessary to think. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.
Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much. That's great. So I think we'll take a break now in the next moment or so. And again, to everybody at home, take the chance to get your cup of coffee, your cup of tea, or whatever it is you need to do. And we look forward to seeing you back here in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, everyone, to this second part of the SCoTENS conference. My name's Noel Purdy. I'm Director of Research and Scholarship at Stranmillis University College, but I'm also very pleased to be a member of the SCoTENS Steering Committee, and I'm a former Northern co-chair of SCoTENS as well. I'm delighted to be introducing this second part of the programme this morning after our very stimulating and indeed very provocative keynote address from Professor Stephen Ball first thing this morning. Could I just explain that the questions that were sent through and put on the chat, unfortunately due to some technical issues, they weren't able to be put through to Maria and Linda, who were asking the questions, but don't worry, because those questions will be forwarded to Professor Stephen Ball. I'm delighted that now we have a pre-recorded message from Minister Norma Foley, who's the Minister for Education in the Republic of Ireland. So we're going to go to that pre-recorded message now. Thanks very much.
Hello to you all. It is a great honour as Minister for Education to address you all here today at the 19th Annual SCoTENS Conference. It really would be wonderful to be together in person, but until that time comes, I am so very pleased to address you virtually. I would also like to take this opportunity to commend the teaching profession across the island of Ireland in terms of its response to the COVID-19 crisis. The capacity to adapt in such challenging circumstances is not just a tribute to the teachers themselves, but to your institutions. You provide the grounding and techniques during a teacher's formative years, which frame their professional competence. In many respects, this speaks to the agenda of today's conference, the role of teacher education and social justice. As a starting point, it is clear that we start all at the point that education is about more than just imparting knowledge to pupils and students. It is about the development of the person, the building of their resilience and equipping them with the tools to face many challenges which may come their way in life. I look forward to hearing and indeed learning from speakers and panellists from a diverse range of backgrounds addressing the theme of social justice in education. Coming from the teaching profession, I have first-hand experience of the value and necessity of innovative teacher education. It is vital that all children and young people are nurtured and valued within the education system. I know that this promotion of inclusivity and excellence is at the very heart of schools across the entire island. Social justice is multi-layered. One area that Ireland is exploring and addressing in the relationship between education and social justice is the link between educational underachievement and economic disadvantage. This is an issue that has persisted for many years within both jurisdictions, notwithstanding the commitment of governments through policy interventions and significant financial investment. Educational underachievement links with poverty in society, with socioeconomic context, and indeed with community. It is part of a much wider issue than education alone. In this past year, my department has strengthened policies on inclusion in education. These new standards reflect a view of a truly inclusive approach, recognising that teachers encounter a diverse range of needs, both additional learning needs and learning needs associated with diverse linguistic, socioeconomic, cultural and ethnic backgrounds in the course of their teaching. I am also delighted that my department has secured the largest ever budget since the commencement of the Delivering Equality of Opportunity in Schools programme aimed at tackling educational disadvantage. This additional investment will enable us to expand the programme to provide enhanced supports to more schools, benefiting more children and young people. The learnings so far from our DESH programme were shared with the Department of Education in Northern Ireland as its work on A Fair Start was being undertaken. I am encouraged that practices and experiences in both jurisdictions are being used to improve, adapt and continue our efforts to ensure that all children and young people regardless of their background, are given the best possible start in life. My department also provides funding for programmes of continuing professional development based on the concept of inclusive education. The areas of anti-racism, identity-based bullying and cultural awareness are addressed through a suite of supports provided to teachers at primary and post-primary level. An important initiative in this regard is the Social, Personal and Health Education Curriculum, which empowers students to learn about and participate in the various communities to which they belong, becoming aware of some of the prejudices and attitudes that fail to respect others. This key programme enables students, through their teachers, to become an active force for social justice, both inside and outside of the classroom. However, while my department and its agencies can develop policies, it is only through constant updating of teacher education programmes such policies become embedded within the system. I appreciate the work of your colleagues and yourselves for your work in this regard. You are shaping the adaptable and versatile teacher. You are providing the student teacher with the space to reflect on their concept of social justice and how to take their values into their teaching practice. I look forward to hearing from today's speakers on how educators can understand and enact social justice so that we can ensure we are all truly in this together. 3 weeks ago, at the Shared Island Dialogue in Education, I was delighted to launch a significant new Shared Island research partnership with SCoTENS. This new research programme, funded by the Shared Island unit in the Taoiseach's department, is for action-orientated research on educational underachievement issues and on a range of teaching and learning themes for teachers and curriculum provision. I do look forward to reading the outcomes of this research and the lessons learned from assessment with education stakeholders. A spirit of close cooperation exists with our education departments and ministers in Northern Ireland. We have faced the same challenges across this last year, and we strive at all times to put the pupil at the heart of each and every aspect of our work. The work of SCoTENS, especially its North-South teacher exchange, has helped to develop this spirit of cooperation and collaboration. In conclusion, I wish to express my thanks to everyone today participating in this webinar. It is important that we have opportunities and settings like this to listen and learn from each other. I look forward to the outcomes of today's participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Foley. And on behalf of SCoTENS, we sincerely appreciate the continued funding that we receive from the Department of Education in the South and indeed from the Department of Education here in Northern Ireland. It gives me great pleasure now to move on and introduce the panel, the discussion panel. And we have 6 guest panellists with us, 4 of whom are with me here in the studio and 2 of whom are joining us on the screen behind me, and hopefully you can see them if you're joining us virtually today. I'm just going to very quickly run through who we have, and then the format is as follows. Each of the panellists has been given the title, and the title for this panel discussion is Education is Meant to be the Great Leveller. Are we all in this together? And each panellist has been given a maximum of 5 minutes to make some introductory remarks. We're going to try and hold our panellists to that time scale, but a maximum of 5 minutes to make some introductory remarks. And during that time, you may have questions which you might want to put in the feed. And we have 2 of my colleagues from the steering committee, Carmel Kearns and Des Carwell, who I can see on the screen, who will be fielding those questions and hopefully feeding them through to me so we can have that discussion for the second 30-minute period. So we have on our panel today Kula Yasuma, who is the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Northern Ireland and has been in that role since 2015. Welcome, Coola. On the screen joining us, we have Dr. Niall Muldoon, who is the Ombudsman for Children in the Republic of Ireland, a near equivalent, I suppose, of Coola's role south of the border. And by coincidence, he has also been in that role since 2015. The third member joining us today is Dr. Alison Mackenzie, and she's beside us on the stage here, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Sociology, Education and Social Work at Queen's University in Belfast. We're also delighted that Dr. Geraldine Mooney-Simmy has travelled up from Limerick to be with us in person today. Thank you, Geraldine, for making that journey yesterday. And Geraldine is the director of episteme, which is the National Centre for STEM Education at UL, University of Limerick. We're also pleased to have Stephen Ramsey, who's the principal of St Gerard's School and Support Services here in Belfast. Thank you for coming in, Stephen, at a very busy time. And finally, joining us virtually is Tracy Tobin, who's the principal of St Michael's Infant National School in Limerick. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Coola Yasuma, who's the Commissioner for Children and Young People, to make her introductory remarks. Coola.
Thanks, and thanks, Noel. And yes, I hope Niall and I will be able to complement each other, but I'm glad I'm going first. So, as Commissioner for Children and Young People in Northern Ireland, we're tasked to implement the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child, or to support our governments to do that. And what the UNCRC says very clearly is that every right for every child. It speaks, as you would expect, it speaks specifically about education, where it says it should be free, and it talks about education addressing a child's talents, personality and abilities. But in order for a child to be able to flourish in education, the CRC recognises that they need to feel safe, they need to be warm, they need to be properly fed, and they need to be emotionally and physically healthy. None of that can happen without more broader rights being fulfilled. And that brings us to, and again I'm showing my age, but to the triangle that's been around for quite a long time, the homeschool community triangle. So for education to be the great leveller, that partnership between homeschool and community, broader society, needs to be intact and needs to be complementary and have some synergies. But when we look at the groups that struggle the most in education, they are children living in poverty, they are children with special educational needs and disability, they are children who have had a range of adverse childhood experiences. So what we have is an education system where children were having educational outcomes that actually reflect the inequalities in our broader society. I just want to say something very briefly about the pandemic. So when our schools closed, North and South, in March of 2020, I don't think any of us predicted what we would learn about the role of schools in our children's lives. And the interruption of children's education has highlighted that schools is so much more than academic learning. It's where they see their friends, where they get support, where they get creative, and where they do physical activity, and so many other things. But for some of our most vulnerable children and young people, school is a refuge, a place where child protection and health issues are responded to. And that is the reminder that teachers and school more broadly is a social justice undertaking. It's more than just education or cramming knowledge into children. And I will very strongly argue that teachers and one of the reasons they go into education, being the mother of a trainee teacher myself, is because they want what's best for our children. And they are, by their very nature, human rights defenders. And they embrace that social justice role. And they understand that they cannot teach children who have a range of stresses and traumas in their home life and outside schools. So we have learned that schools, not just education, schools are a place of sanctuary and are more than just where children go to learn. And I think now as we move forward, and in Northern Ireland we've got our reform, we've got the work that you led on, Noel, Fair Start, that has to be a reminder as we move forward to improve. So yes, is education the great leveller? No. Education's not the great leveller because it's too big a task to ask one system to do. But can it be a part of the solution? It absolutely can, because we are in this together.
Thank you very much, Kula, and well done for sticking to time. That was
First time today.
That was amazing. I'm delighted now to move to the screen, and we have Dr. Niall Muldoon, who's the Ombudsman for Children in the Republic of Ireland. Niall, I invite you now to make your opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Noel, and it is unfortunate to go after Kula. She stole my thunder with lots of stuff. But from my point of view, I suppose what I want to do is maybe focus on a couple of cohorts of children. I think COVID sort of gave us an idea where equality really is at. If we remind ourselves of what Mike Ryan, the Deputy Director of WHO, said, that the COVID crisis has flashed a light and shone a light on the inequalities that were already there, the cracks in society that we already had. We as an organisation, the Ombudsman for Children's Office here, had 5 cohorts that we've been focusing on in our strategic plan over the last number of years. Children with mental health issues, children with homelessness, traveller and Roma children, children with disabilities, and children in direct provision. Each and every one of those cohorts were extremely badly served through the COVID pandemic because the inequalities that they live with constantly. I think we had to recognise that, and maybe just within I'll just take an example of one of them. One of the things we did do was create a short report where we took the voices of children in direct provision who had gone through the COVID scenario. And one of the things they said was that COVID shone a light for the rest of society on the way they live their lives, which is in a closed room, behind closed doors, with very little support and very little ability to move around. So the rest of society got to see a little bit of theirs, but they also highlighted that, they had to try and continue their education in a situation where they didn't have laptops, where any of the centres that they lived in had computer rooms were locked, the Wi-Fi was intermittent, and their parents had no ability to help them with the schooling. Even they might not even have the language, and the help that they used to get from the teachers was not there as well. So again, that's only one example of the cohorts. I wrote specifically to the Minister for Education probably after 3 months of the COVID lockdown, and I would have highlighted 4 areas again. Same children are involved. Those children with mental health issues, children with special education needs, those in socio-economic distress, and the digital divide, which is across the whole country. And again, it's that inequality that is there. As Kula said, I think what we've asking for a lot of schools, particularly even when we have the Daesh situation in the south of Ireland, we're asking those schools to be an oasis in the middle of a desert. We're acknowledging there's a disadvantage across the society. That's why we designate the school. But then we don't flood the rest of society with support in the way we do the schools. So the schools are hoping to lift the child out without the support of the parents, the employment, the addiction services, adult education. One of the targets I've set or asked about was, can we get a situation in which Daesh schools actually celebrate coming out of Daesh status? Mm-hmm. And that can only happen if the rest of the community is supported to lift those children out. Because what you're doing otherwise is creating a number of role models that you hope will inspire children, whereas you're not supporting the parents, you're not supporting the community around them to help them in the way that we would want them to be. So for me, I think, as Kula said, the question is, can education be the great leveler? I think it can. I think it's moving in that direction. It's helped in a lot of cases, but we want to make it more than just an occasional role model coming out of disadvantaged areas. We want to lift the communities out of disadvantage. That takes a whole of government approach, and I look forward to seeing that happening. I think that it did happen once or twice throughout the pandemic, that we saw that interagency cooperation, and we can certainly take a lot of lessons from that. The other piece we can see is the importance of school, as Kula said, in a social environment. The social capital that goes with being in school, the wide-ranging areas, and for me, that's the real crucial one, because that's Article 29 of the UNCRC. Education is not just about the academic learning, it's about the social, it's about the potential, it's about reaching the best person you can be through your mind, body, and education. So, yeah, I look forward to the rest of the discussion, and I'll stop there. Thank you, Noel.
Thanks very much, Niall. And already we're beginning to see some interesting parallels and similarities north and south of the border, particularly in relation to the impact of COVID. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Dr. Alison Mackenzie, who's a senior lecturer at the School of Sociology, Education and Social Work here in Belfast at Queen's University. Alison.
Thank you, Noel. Well, my take is slightly different, and I won't be mentioning COVID-19, but I think that we will find points of accordance. So, no is the simple answer. Education should be the primary means by which to advance equality, equity, social mobility, and therefore social justice. But in the UK at least, education is the most powerful entrenched means by which inequality, inequity, social immobility, and social injustice are perpetuated. And these iniquities are sustained by educational policies and structures that support state-funded selection by school in terms of class, ethnicity, and SEN. And once they are in school, by ability setting, top, middle, and lower sets, or streaming according to general ability. Secondary education is very nearly comprehensive across the UK, but we have one of the most hierarchical higher education sectors in the world, driven by different degrees of selection across institutions. Why does selection endure while there is so much research showing that its baneful effects on disadvantaged children? Perhaps because where power is, power accumulates. Advocates of selective schooling invariably claim that it enhances social mobility by providing the opportunity for high-ability children from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds to access a high-quality secondary education along similarly high-ability children with positive impacts on educational attainment and life trajectories. However, cohort studies, a type of longitudinal study that tracks participants over time, suggest that grammar schools have not stimulated social mobility. Grammar school pupils' chances were comparable to those of comprehensive school pupils with similar socioeconomic backgrounds and primary school test scores. If we want to confer genuine advantage to a child's chances of attending an elite university, then we should send them to a private PFANG school. Opponents using evidence-based research and moral arguments argue that selection is divisive. The 11+ examination or the transfer test is unfair, and that these processes depress overall educational achievement within a general catchment area, all of which have a negative effect on the poorest children in that area. Let's take one example, since it is Northern Ireland. The 11+ or the transfer test, aside from problems with test reliability, by testing at that age to allocate a child to a school based on ability is to assume that intelligence is fixed. We know from neuroscience that neural plasticity means that neural networks in the brain continue to change and grow throughout our lives. We don't stop learning. In any case, there may be myriad reasons why a child does not perform well at 11 or 18, the next big stage of selection, including deprivation, undiagnosed conditions such as autistic spectrum condition, visual or hearing impairment, poor mental health, hostile family environments, hostile social environments, and parents who lack the wherewithal to pay tutors £30 per hour to coach their child through the transfer test. Identifying a subset of pupils for special treatment at the age of 11 or 18 is arbitrary, unfair, and discriminatory. And how do the children who are not selected for the top schools feel? Qualitative research reveals common themes: feelings of inferiority, anger, shame, and stigma, which hinder positive relations with teachers and peers. Selection and ability setting research has shown that expectations of students are lowered and their entry to subjects restricted or capped to serve accountability metrics. not only on assumptions of intelligence, ability or aptitude, but also on gender, ethnicity or able-bodiedness or able-mindedness. If we accept that educational equality is a fundamental principle of social justice and is socially controllable, then we should neither select nor reject to rear an elite or even a privileged middle class. We should end all selection and league tables and rethink about how universities select students. We should aim to have diversity in all institutions, educating on the basis of potential, not on perceived lack or socioeconomic background. Students with different abilities, identities and experiences learning together create valuable opportunities for peer and collaborative learning and encourage mutual understanding and inclusion. As a pupil in a recent study on the positive and inclusive effects of mixed ability settings said, it's 32 brains, and from one brain everybody can learn and say if somebody got something wrong. Other brains can help them and then they can work on their own. Another that. I think it's a really good idea because we can teach each other rather than being at the same level and knowing the same things and not knowing the same things. So if I don't get something, I will ask somebody who does. However, weaning pro-selection politicians, teachers and parents of their addiction to selection will not be easy. And a little bit of Plato before we finish. Thrasymachus in Plato's Gorgias explains that, I quote, "Justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Each kind of regime, democratic, oligarchic, autocratic, makes laws in the interests of the ruling party and declare that what they have made, what is to their own advantage, is just for their subjects. Justice, in other words, is the advantaged of the established regime." Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Earlier on, Alison told me that she had a strong message for us today, and she certainly didn't disappoint. So thank you for that. And if you do have comments and questions, as I said at the start, feel free to put them in the feed, and we'll hopefully get a chance to field some of those questions and comments later on. But we have three other panellists that I want to give an opportunity for them to present their opening remarks. And our next panellist is Dr. Geraldine Mooney-Simi, who has travelled up from the episteme, the National Centre for STEM Education at the University of Limerick. Yes. Geraldine, I think, has some slides that she's going to take us through.
Yes.
But you have the same stipulation of 5 minutes, Geraldine,
Fine.
So I'm going to hand over to you now. Thanks very
lovely.
much.
Thank you, Noel. And I'm in agreement with previous speakers. They all in this together is a very good question rather than an exclamation mark, I think, at this stage. The evidence is very strong. It's very interesting that we're 21 years into the 21st century and we're taking a stock of where we are with regard to teacher education and social justice. And my few slides are talking about the theorization of something different and anew, and looking at a repoliticization of education from this perspective as well. So what I want to move on to my next slide, if I can here, my perspective in this talk is from a critical feminist heuristic. My work is, research work is coming from that area, and my aim here is to broaden the question around teacher education and social justice and education and social justice, to broaden the question out, to look at it from a wider perspective, to say who is framing the question and who's included in the frame, and what questions are excluded from the frame. I'm reminded of a dark period after the Second World War where Hannah Arendt told us that what was really the most dark period after the extermination camps and recent genocides has been the negation of spontaneity, human spontaneity, the negation of that, and the negation of a plurality of human condition. And both of these are back around with us again in a world where we are back into maybe some kind of quasi-totalitarian view of education. So I'm looking here in this slide now, I'm making a case for our reflexivity. I'm making a case that as educators, that we are all capable of symbolic violence, even with good intentions. So it's up to everybody with their hand in education, and that includes teachers, school leaders, teacher educators, but it also includes researchers, and it also includes the policy makers. We are all having to rethink and be aware of our capacity for symbolic violence. So the question is, who are we at this stage in the 21st century? Who do we think we are? Are we pieces of human capital? Are we just commodities, where we try and become the ideal or measure ourselves against the ideal? Or have we got a broader view? Do we understand the primacy of ethics being the underpinning of education, as Stephen Ball reminded us this morning? Are we looking at UNESCO's latest futuristic view of education, which is talking about learning to become a person? And are we looking at that instead of this idea of a self-regulated learner, that we're actually going to describe ourselves as independent, dependent, and interdependent all at the same time, fully human and fully alive? So I'm very taken with Nancy Fraser's theorisation of social justice, parity of participation. I'm very taken with the work of Kathleen Lynch. And Nancy reminds us that to view this, we must look at it in 3 dimensions. It's not only good enough to look at it from the point of view of redistribution of resources, although they're important. It's not only good enough to look at it as just recognition in terms of cultural, who has voice and who hasn't. It also must be looked at from the political dimension of representation. And that representation position is very strongly connected to the political of reframing and the whole concept of re-theorising. I have a book coming in the next few weeks. I don't mind giving it a plug here. It actually raises some of these questions that I'm theorising about. I'm working with a group of international critical feminists around the world. We believe that one way of interrupting the discourse at the moment in education is to interrupt it at transnational level, since that seems to be where a lot of the discourse is coming from, and where there is a diminution of the role of the nation state. And we all better wake up to that. So if democracy is being hollowed out, the question for us is how can we transform it, rethink it, renew it? And so we're looking at, otherwise there's going to be an intellectual poverty, and essentially we're going to do a real injustice to society, to our humanity, and to the planet if we don't do this work. We have important questions we need to ask. All I'm going to say here is, what is the purpose of education now in the 21st century, and where is the moral responsibility for the policy makers here, as well as the teachers, as well as the educators? And where is the moral responsibility for a nation state when we hear that 48% of the teachers across all the OECD countries under 30 years of age do not have full-time employment? Where is the sanctuary in school for them? So I leave you with a few of my latest research pieces on this. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the debate and working with the colleagues here and being a member of SCoTENS 2021. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. Congratulations on your forthcoming book as well. That's great. I'd like to celebrate our success, north and south of the border. We have 2 more panellists, and we've saved the best to last because actually as academics and policymakers, we think it's crucially important that we hear the voice of practitioners who are working day in, day out on the coalface. And so first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Ramsey, who's the principal of St George's School and Sports Services here in Belfast. And I'm going to hand over to Stephen now to answer this question. Education is meant to be the great leveller. Are we all in this together, Stephen?
Very good question, Noel. I'm going to actually take it back to experiences in relation to COVID over the last year and a half, and specifically in the very first lockdown, that we faced many challenges that never before were we ever believed that we'll ever be in again. In fact, you know, Just to give a bit of context, our school is a 3 to 19 special school. We're probably one of the largest special schools in the north. We have over 160 staff. But we talk about inequality. 72% of our children are on free school meals. So right away, our children are faced not only with the struggle of the economic background that they're coming from, but they're also faced with the immediate disadvantage that they have a special educational need. All children, 352 children in St George's, have a statement. Previous panels have mentioned, and I think it is very, very important, that the academic, yes, is extremely important, but during COVID, we as a school face many, many more pressing issues than the academic achievement of our pupils. Just to put this into context, and this sort of leads to major learnings that came out of COVID for us. We got an email from a parent basically asking for help, and the help was that she was struggling to feed her family. Now, that actually had a major impact on us as a staff. So what happened was we realised that if one parent was in this situation, we probably had quite a significant number given the economic background of the majority of our students. So we talked about this as a senior leadership team, and it was decided that what we would do was we would ask staff first. We didn't really know what to do. We knew that there was community organisations and there was food banks that were beginning, but we put it out to staff, and it was actually overwhelming that over £5,000 was raised by the staff. Now, we also had a record of very vulnerable. We knew that there were families struggling, but we also knew that there were those who were struggling more than others that we would have been constantly helping throughout the school year at particular times such as Christmas and things like that. But we're also sensitive to the dignity of parents, how we go about this. You know, that was a major point for us. This is actually the first time I've talked about this, but we didn't make it public. But we had a communication tool in school, Seesaw, some people may be aware of, and we began to directly contact parents to see what would happen. And we got over 120 parents asking for some help, and we knew. So staff started ordering essential goods. We set up a little food bank within the school. But we also realised that this £5,000 wasn't going to last, given the circumstances that we faced. So what we began to ask as a staff was, what else can we do? We need to be the voice. We need to be the people. We need to be the voice for these very vulnerable parents at this particular time. And obviously, by helping the parents, we could see the direct relationship, obviously, with helping our children. So we began to be a little bit more strategic. Okay, it was sort of on an ad hoc basis, priority right away, and we began to apply for grants, and we were managed to get grants of £12,000. We simultaneously contacted food banks to give the list of the names to of the parents, so that this continued, that the impact wasn't just from us, but the community organisations started to get wind of exactly where our parents were. Staff morale increased, the links between the parents increased, because there was a massive trust that was there. But to go back to the question, in terms of injustice and education, we found that from our point of view, that unless there is that community and parents can trust, parents can trust the staff then, but we were doing that as a small community. And we believe that for this to happen and be sustainable, and the impact of what we could see to be sustainable, then all those stakeholders need to listen to what has been said by previous panellists. And yes, the academic is extremely important, but unless we get the social and the economic issues within certain communities within this areas that we all come from, then we're going to be constantly faced with the problems that we are now.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and very strong words there as well from the coalface, as it were, you know, through COVID and the very challenging experiences of the last couple of years. Last but not least, and waiting very patiently in Limerick, is Tracy Tobin. Tracy is the principal of St Michael's Infant National School in Limerick. Tracy, I'd invite you now to make your opening remarks.
Thanks very much. So, as you said, I'm principal of St Michael's Infant School, which is based in the city centre in Limerick, and it's a DEIS Band 1 school, and we have juniors, seniors and first, and 2 special classes for autistic children. So if you want to go back to, say, my own situation, I myself would have come from a disadvantaged background, and I would have grown up in an area that would be considered deprived, even though I hate using those negative words. And my parents separated. So we ended up living with my grandparents, who had not finished formal education, but were adamant that their grandchildren would complete their formal education, and pushed us and pushed us and pushed us to ensure that we went to school and that we got as much as we could out of education. And I think that factored with the school that I would have attended, where I had a teacher, and I can actually single-handedly point out the teacher who is the reason why I'm a teacher today. And it was the teacher for me that believed in me, that pushed me, that understood my background, that complimented everything that we all did. And, you know, she just taught us to our ability. We never experienced failure. We always experienced success. And I think that was crucial. That was really crucial. And when I went on to secondary school, I'd had that teacher for 2 years. I remember the Irish teacher in secondary school saying to me, "Tracy, who taught you in primary school?" And I told her, she said, "Who taught you in 5th and 6th?" And I said the name. She said, "Your standard of Irish is excellent." And I really credit that to the teacher at the time, and the teacher that believed in every single one of us. And I only met her recently, and I told her, I said, "You are the reason I am who I am." And what I'm getting at here is, I do believe that we as teachers, we're in very, very, very privileged positions. And our role is really privileged in that we can make changes to the lives of children. We really can. We can show them that we believe in them. We can show them that they can be whatever they want to be. It doesn't matter what they want to be, that they can be whatever they want to be. And who they are doesn't matter. That it's so important that they value who they are, where they come from, and that they get the respect that they deserve. And I'm thinking of one group in particular, and that would be members of the travelling community, who I would have worked with quite a lot throughout my years, my 25 years of teaching in DEIS schools. And I absolutely love the members of the travelling community. They're so honest, they're so outgoing, they are so easy to work with. But so many of them and their families have experienced educational trauma, and they have a lot of mistrust in the educational system. And I know in my situation in my school, we put a lot of work into building that trust, including them in the education of their children, showing them how important they are in the lives of their children, and building up, I suppose, the responsibility that they have in them for their children, and showing them, you know, what they can do for their children. Because, you know, a lot of them believe that they are of no use to their children because they themselves didn't finish education. But it's so important for them to believe in themselves, and to believe that they can be, and their children can be whatever they want to be. So I do believe that it's so important for us as teachers to recognise the wonderful role that we have as educators, not only educating with the curriculum, but ensuring that children know that they can aspire to be whatever they want to be. And I suppose, like, it's schools alone cannot do it on their own, as Stephen alluded to earlier. We really need to reach out. We're only one piece of the jigsaw. Society has to respond to the needs of children and the needs of children in our schools. And it is so important that society does that. And I suppose as a group of DEIS schools in Limerick, we've been very fortunate in that we grouped together as a group of principals in DEIS schools, and we created a network with the help of Mary Immaculate College, the local education centre and the Department of Education. And we met very regularly during the school year, and we continue to do so. And we found that really beneficial, because we sat down, we discussed all our needs, the needs of the children, the needs of our school communities. And together we applied for grants, and we were able to link in with agencies that were able to offer supports to our children. And that has really, really, really benefited our children. And one such support that we would have linked out to, and which we would have gotten from, was in Bedford Row Family Project in Limerick City. And Bedford Row would be a project that would assist families who are affected by imprisonment. And that really stood to a lot of schools during the lockdowns, because not a lot of people knew that, but children who had parents or family members in prison were no longer able to see them during the lockdown. So for some of our children, they didn't get to see their parent for a number of months. Other children whose parents were in prison were suddenly left out with no transition work done, no, assisting in helping the families to reunite. And they were suddenly left out of prisons because there was too many people in the prisons. And those families were left alone to cope with that without the support of schools, without the support of the homeschool community liaison coordinators at the time. So many of those families struggled during lockdown, and there wasn't much publicity around that. But Bedford Row Family Project, because we had the linkage with them, we were able to link in with them to ensure that our families, our children, who we knew had members in prison, were supported, had everything they needed, and were happy and we're in an okay place.
Tracy, I'm going to ask you to draw your comments to a close there.
Sorry.
We've gone to 5 or 6 minutes, and I'm very keen to open it up to discussion.
Yeah,
no,
absolutely.
don't apologise, but I'm keen to, if you could just finish off in a sentence.
Yeah. I do believe that education is a leveller, but not on its own. I do believe that we need to link out to the communities and into society in general, and that we all need to take responsibility for the children in our country.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Tracy, for that, and apologies for having to curtail your comments. So we now come to the open discussion, and ideally at this stage there should be questions coming through a feed. And I see Carmel is on screen there. So I wonder, Carmel, do you have an opening question, or Des has rejoined us as well? Carmel?
I do. Can you hear me now?
I can, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I suppose I'm very taken by everything that the panel are saying about marginalised voices, and Tracy talked about families affected by imprisonment and members of the travelling community, and Gerard talked poignantly, I suppose, about that parent struggling to feed her family. And I know Niall talked about children and parents, I suppose, with mental health issues and special education needs, and the digital divide, and children experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage. So I suppose the question is really returning to what Professor Ball spoke about. How can we as systems leaders and as school leaders and as teacher educators, how can we support the reframing that Geraldine Mooney-Simi talked about, the kind of reprioritising of the moral purpose of teaching?
Okay, so how do we prioritise the reframing of education? Perhaps there's an opportunity post-COVID. I remember this time last year, there were lots of webinars like this with lots of blue sky thinking about how we can take things forward. And I wonder, has that dissipated a little bit in the last 12 months? But how do we seize that opportunity? Geraldine, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I think just very briefly, I'd say what Stephen Ball has invited us this morning to do is to open the question and to keep it open. I think that's very important, because there's a natural rush to close the question down and to come up with a formula. So I think to keep the question open and keep it in dialogue is very vital. And I think another thing at this particular moment in time, to have a philosophical debate about it, a critical and philosophical debate, and to keep that debate open as long as we can. I think that Ireland, North and South, would really get an advantage from that. And I think that would be the start. And I think I hear across everybody talking, it's cruel optimism to think that the school and the teachers can do all of this on their own. We're embedded in society. We've the state, the schools, the society, and the global world, and we're in that space now.
Okay, so how do we keep that dialogue open then, Kula?
Again, everything everyone said. I suppose my question is who you have the dialogue with, and who's involved in that conversation. Because we've heard, what I've heard from Stephen today is really very, very important, and it's critical that that story is heard. But are we having those conversations in the same echo chambers? Because what you talked about there was where the power lies to make the decisions, and the vested interests, and the power bees. So it's how we say it in a way to make sure that the people we need to hear it, that will move this forward, hear it, and not just talk.
How do we do that?
And I suppose that's what I would say to educators, is to reach beyond, your traditional, your comfort space, you know, your peers. Reach beyond that to the people who make the difference. So this is one of the great things about social media and the opening up of communication. You know, if you put aside all the nastiness, it's a great way to have those conversations. It's a great way to say, you cannot ignore this, to create that movement. But also in Northern Ireland, we're coming up to an election next May, and electioneering has started, obviously. And I think that it's how we create those conversations in the hustings on the doorstep. If you want my vote, this is what I want to hear you say.
Thanks, Kula. I'm going to bring in Niall there as well to give us another southern perspective perhaps on that. How do you work at your level to try and keep the dialogue open, to keep the conversations, to listen to the right voices and to make sure that policymakers are hearing those voices?
Well, first of all, I think the concept of return to the moral purpose of teaching, I think Stephen really challenged us this morning. But I think you've got live examples there, both Tracy and Stephen in the studio. That's the moral purpose. I mean, that's the most moral thing you can do. The engagement with the community when they didn't have to. Teachers went above and beyond in every area of the country. They did more than they needed to, and they did it for the purpose of the child. That's the moral purpose of anybody, is to enhance the community you live in. So I don't think we're too far away from that in lots of cases, but I think the system doesn't support them in the way that they need to be done. From my point of view, I think one of the major voices that are missing here is children. You know, I think, Geraldine, you listed a lot of people as well in relation to who needs to be engaged in this, but children and their voices. And the thing, and Kula will say this, and you hear me saying this all the time, children have the answers and they never ask for too much. So it's never going to break the system what they ask for, but we need to hear them more and more. And again, if you're talking about blue skies thinking, they're the guys. They're the guys that have no limitations. They know exactly what can happen and what their imaginations will allow them to do. And I think Geraldine's right too. We have to keep this conversation open. It doesn't come to a conclusion. This is an every generation discussion, how education can change and adapt. For me, I'm quite happy to keep pushing it at department level as well, but I think we need to hear the voice of the children. Okay,
thanks for that, Niall. I'm going to move on to another question. I'm hoping that Des might be able to feed us another question from our delegates today.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Des, yeah.
Lovely to see you all. Hello from Limerick. Stimulating conversation. A question from the floor from our colleague Harry McMahon asked the question, teachers are human rights defenders and so should be teacher educators. Do we do enough to make our students aware of this core element of our job?
Well, I'm gonna fire that one straight over to Alison here. So give us your perspective on that one, Alison.
So do teachers, are teachers aware that they're defenders of human rights?
Yeah, they talk about.
And do we do enough to make that clear to student teachers, I suppose?
No.
Yes.
No, it's just no. Again, sorry, no. I think what we often hear in schools, and I speak to as a former teacher myself in Scotland, and where the Scottish Government have embedded the United Nations of the Conventions of the Rights of the Child into the legislative framework. But despite the fact of that, rights are contingent. It depends on whose rights you're talking about. No, generally speaking, you know, the rights are available for all, but teachers tend to make them contingent on. Yeah. That's what I mean. I don't, you know, no. He's like, we're all right bearers, including children, but there is a tendency to disregard the rights of the child, largely because we regard them as lacking competency, and that because power is vested with the teacher. And so if children don't comply or they don't conform, or they misbehave, then their rights are removed from them. And, you know, and so you are entitled to your rights, but only if you act responsibly. And we never turn that on its head and say, well, actually, as a teacher, are you behaving responsibly? And so, I mean, one of the ways that rights in schools are infringed on a frequent basis is when children are sent out of the class because they're not behaving. And that's a rather utilitarian approach to rights respecting schools. It is, you know, because the majority supersedes that of the single individual child. So I think there needs to be a far more comprehensive understanding of what a right is, who is entitled to a right. And somebody said earlier on, and we all agree here, we need to listen to children far, far, far more than we do. And there is excellent work going on at Queen's that is encouraging researchers to include the voice of the child.
Okay,
Thanks,
and I do want to hear the voice of the school leaders here as well. So, Stephen, what does this mean on a day-to-day basis in schools? Then, you know, we've heard that a call for more focus on children's rights. Is that, how explicit is that in the school setting, or is it something that's much more implicit as you get on with your day-to-day work?
I think it's paramount. I think that there's, you know, as people have previously stated, we do need to listen to our children. I think that one of the things that we need to be very aware of is that it doesn't turn out to be tokenism, from the point of view that what we're doing is we're looking at the voice of children because we have to at times, and it seems to be the you know, especially from a school perspective, have you carried out some surveys in relation to your school? But it has to be taken on board. We as a special school constantly would be looking at the views through our children, specifically within certain classes, because given the need, sometimes it's extremely difficult. But going forward, I definitely think that it needs to be much more than tokenism, because my experience of it in previous establishments, that very often that was the case.
Okay, thanks. Geraldine, I know, wants to come in, and then I'm going to go to Tracy as well. So, yeah. Geraldine
just
first.
Just one quick point. I'm a member of CAFE. It's the Byrne College of Art ground-up movement about improving student voice in Irish education. And it is already in the programme for government that the student voice would be improved on. However, there is a real danger of it being tokenism and it being turned into rate my teacher. As opposed to actually the voice about what kind of world we want, what kind of better world we want, how we're going to make a just global world together, all of those big questions. That's the danger.
Exactly. And Tracy, how do you move them beyond tokenism in terms of listening to the voice of children within your school?
I think it's like, look, we can all integrate children into our schools, but we need to ask ourselves the question, do we include them? Are they included? Are they actually taking part in the classroom every single day? And I think, you know, that we have a role to play in ensuring that we adapt our teaching styles, we adapt our classrooms, whatever it is that we have to do to ensure that all children feel included. And to do that, we need to listen to the children. We need to look, like in an infant school, sometimes it can be difficult to get the voice of the child, but there's other ways. There's observations, you know, there's lots of talking to their families, there's talking to their siblings, there's lots of ways around it. But I do think it's crucial that children are listened to. They're entitled to have a voice. They should have a voice. And once children are heard, then their needs can be met. And I think that is really, really, really important.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. I'm going to go back to my colleagues Carmel and Des in the hope that there's another question from our delegates to come through. Carmel or Des?
Yeah, Noel, I might just put a few comments that are coming from the floor. Just Sandra, first of all, is agreeing with the commentary here about the importance of the voice of children. And in response to the question by Harry McMahon, a comment has come in that social justice education is an aspect of sociology education in Mary Immaculate in Limerick. So the Limerick flag is being flown very high there. Another comment that has come in, which perhaps I might turn into a question. Somebody says, as teachers and teacher educators who are the products of the current school system, it'll be a challenge to devise policies and structures for a different educational experience for future students. So I suppose maybe we could ask the panel, how big a challenge is that, and is it surmountable? How do we surmount that challenge?
Okay, so how do we surmount the fact that the legacy of the past as we look towards a brighter future? Any takers on that one to start off? Kula?
Well, I'm going to take you back to the previous question, which is about teacher education and children's rights and how we support our teachers to be human rights defenders. And I think that is the root of the answer to this question, which is that a lot of teacher training has a session on human rights, on children's human rights. So there's this session, and people like me get wheeled in, and we wave our UNCRC around, and we tell them that they're human rights defenders, and we talk to them about rights, and then we're wheeled out again, and they get on with whatever the next subject is. I think, and that's a very, very, really good. I mean, you know, tokenism is the beginning of something. So I don't like tokenism any more than anyone, but at least people understand they need to do it in the first place, to quote one of Alison's colleagues. So when we're talking about changing the system, and as I said, people become teachers because I think they do want to make the world a better place for children, with children. It's how you embed that notion of social justice in everything you do, in teaching people to teach maths, in teaching people how to teach history, in making it, you know, the whole incorporation of the CRC in Scotland is about weaving it, making it part of the DNA, making it the writing in the rock rather than a standalone sweetie on its own. And it's not that. And rights, children never lose their rights. No matter what they do, their rights are there. And by empowering our teachers to become social justice activists and human rights defenders, that's how we change the dynamic. Well, one of the ways, change the dynamics. So it is embedding children's rights into teacher education.
Okay, I've got time for one more comment on that one. Geraldine, I think is keen to come in again.
I think Bell Hooks reminded me that there's always a chance to dare to transgress. There's always space in the education system. It waxes and wanes in different ways, but there is always space. We have to feel that space as educators in there to make that difference. I think if we lose the capacity to have any emancipatory possibilities and we just give up hope without it being cruel optimism, but we have to understand that the space is there, we have to take it.
Yes, and it reminds me of a comment by Marilyn Cochrane-Smith, who was our keynote speaker at the SCoTENS conference a couple of years ago in Cavan. He talks about teachers being agents of change, and realising that potential, of course, doesn't it? I'm very conscious of time here, and I'm keen to give everybody one last word, but literally a couple of sentences, and I know this is going to be very challenging for our panel members. But I'm very challenged by what Professor Stephen Ball talked about this morning. And I suppose the very negative view of school, he talked about school being intolerable and irredeemable. You know, is school, that sort of notion of school post-COVID, and we're not really post-COVID yet, are we? We're still mid-COVID. Is school really irredeemable? And let's, I hope, finish on a positive note. So I'm going to go around in the order in which I asked you to introduce yourselves at the start, and I'm going to give you a minute each, and I'm going to be very tight on time on this. So I'm going to start again with Kula.
School's absolutely not irredeemable. What you heard this morning, I think whilst harsh, it would be hard to disagree. But the structure, and we can change the structure. We do need a little bit to break it and then rebuild it, listening to the experts, whether that's teachers, whether that's parents, whether that's policymakers, and it's definitely children. So I don't think it's irredeemable. School and education is so important, but what it's currently doing is reflecting society's inequalities. It's not actually repairing them or healing them. And it's not until we understand that we need to change the world and put it back on a different axis that school will be redeemed.
Thanks, Kula. Next is Niall Muldoon. Is school irredeemable in your eyes?
Absolutely not. Again, I think Stephen this morning was hugely challenging and rightly so. I think I love the way he said that when we talk about the new space, he says we don't have to set out the alternative beforehand. We need to find our way towards a new space. And I think that's what we need to do. And we need to keep this door open. We need to keep this conversation going. And we need to invite as many wild and weird and wonderful people to talk to us about it. People from totally different industries to say, how else can we do something? How do we pass on communication? How do we pass on wisdom and knowledge, which is not just academic? You know, do we go back to the Eastern style where it's all through families? The knowledge of the elders, all those sorts of things are open to us now. We need to start thinking about that in a different way. And I think the world is our oyster from that regard. And I look forward to seeing it, because I think that's what's going to be different for my grandchildren, hopefully. It's 2 generations from now when the education system will look different. But we need to start it now and get that conversation going.
Okay, thanks, Niall. The next person I went to before was Alison, so I'm going to come back to Alison. And there was a lot of despair in that keynote address this morning. Is that your mood as well today?
I don't think our school is irredeemable. We have evidence of that here, the wonderful things that individual schools can do, but they're bucking the trend and they're fighting against an entrenched system. And I think that if we are going to have sky blue thinking or be revolutionary in our thoughts about education, it has to be at this level of the system. And politicians in particular have got to start change the way they speak about education, think about education, and also what they say about deprivation and this deleterious impact that deprivation has on disadvantaged children's opportunities in schools.
Thanks, Alison. Geraldine, you were next. Would you echo that?
Yeah, what I would say is that we have, as educators, we must wrestle the field of education back from just being industrial psychology. It has to be the arts and history and philosophy have to be brought in back. We have to wrestle the field of education back in that space. And I think I would be keeping a door open. I think Stephen's question was very important. But I think we have to keep that door open for a critical philosophy debate about it. So there's 2 things I think we have to do. And in teacher education, I think we have to invite reflexivity into teacher education, not just reflection. Teachers are capable of symbolic violence. They have to get in there into a deeper inner world and understand where they're coming from a wide awakeness. But also we need to return mediation with the wider world. That has been taken out of Irish policy since 2009 and Michael Sexton's paper on the wider social, moral and political mediation with the wider world. You will not find that written in any policy now, that the teacher must connect with the wider world. And we need to get back there.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine. 2 more and we come to the school leaders and we can't leave you out of this. Stephen, what's your view on this?
Absolutely not. I think that we're actually in a position now that, and I'm speaking specifically here in the north, in the sense that documents have recently been released in relation to the area plan. We've seen the strategic principles behind the area plan. For us as school leaders, basically the proof will be in the pudding of how the operational information comes out of that and how the schools are reconstructed. There's a massive opportunity here, but that then leads back into our teaching universities, teaching colleges. We need to be looking at what the need is within the schools, and I think that there is a need also that for our teacher education universities to understand that it is a completely different environment in an awful lot of schools post-COVID. We're talking about the recovery curriculum. Has that been talked about in the universities? Has that been look at how that is actually implemented? Professor Barry Carpenter recently is suggesting that this is going to be a 2, a 5, a 10-year impact that this is going to have on our pupils. So the question that I would be asking is that if we're really interested in our teacher education facilities, are things like this being taken into consideration as opposed to just teaching those particular areas of the curriculum? And I think there is an opportunity. There is a real opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. And the last word goes to Tracy from Limerick. Are schools irredeemable?
Absolutely not. I think COVID has shown how important schools are. During COVID, schools opened up, even though they were closed. They opened up. They contacted every parent. They were made sure every single child was okay. We really were the safety net for many children. And you have to remember that school is probably the only constant for a lot of families, and that's really important to remember. I really do think it's important that it's so and it is important for society to understand that, to open up and to I suppose to fund schools in a better way, to ensure that they can do the job to the best of their ability. Schools are very underfunded. I think it's is it €1 a day per child? You know, that's the capitation grant in the south for primary school children. And like we're dealing with the fallout of COVID, we're dealing with the trauma in children, anxiety. One quick story: a teacher asked at the group of junior infants, you know, what do balloons remind you of? And your automatic response would be a birthday party. And the response was when you go to a funeral. And this was post-COVID. This is the reality on the ground. This is what has been happening to lots of children, where they didn't have the comfort of coming to school during closures, for teachers and for, you know, the educators in schools to help these children get through certain situations. So for me, I think COVID has shown the importance of schools, how underfunded schools are, and the important role that schools have going forward, and the importance for policy to change in relation to schools, in relation to society. Schools are the centre of the society, and everything should work around schools to ensure the best outcomes for children. And get rid of the word disadvantaged. I hate it. I think it's so negative. It's really not. It's just not nice. I grew up with it all my life, and I just think it's awful. And nobody should ever be afraid to use their address either, because that's a big issue in schools. Children that are from disadvantaged backgrounds are afraid to use their address in applying for jobs. I was one of those children when I finished college. It should never happen, and I think society as a whole has to change.
Okay, thank you so much. And at this stage, at 5 to 1, I'm going to have to draw things to a close, not just for our panel discussion, but for the entire conference. But could I first of all thank our panel members, the 4 who are here in the studio with me, and also the 2 who are on screen behind me, for a really stimulating discussion. I think we're really only getting started, and we probably could go on for quite a few hours still to try and tackle some of these big questions about education north and south of the border. I think clearly there are differences between the 2 jurisdictions, and we're very aware of what they might be, but there are also huge similarities, and I think we are united in the sense that we're still dealing with the consequences of COVID, and we look forward to opportunities as well as challenges in the days and weeks and years that lie ahead. So thank you to our panellists, and it only remains for me just to thank a number of people before we finish the conference. First of all, if I could thank Minister Foley for her recorded message and for her support for the work of SCoTENS, and indeed, as I said before, the funding that comes from the Department of Education north and south of the border, as well as the member organisations for their subscriptions. Without that, SCoTENS couldn't exist and couldn't be that unique place that it's been since 2003 as a safe space for teacher educators north and south to come together to discuss really important and relevant and challenging issues like what we've been facing here today. Could I also thank my fellow steering committee members who have all contributed in various ways, both in front of the camera with Maria and Linda, and you've seen Des and Carmel as well, but also those behind the scenes who've been working very hard to ensure that today passed off successfully. In particular, I'd like to thank the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, Anthony Soares, and in particular Tricia Kelly, who has done a tremendous job in providing all the administrative support for making sure today happened. And the folk here at NIVAC in East Belfast and this wonderful studio setup for making that available to us this morning. It's the first time we've done this kind of hybrid conference. I think it's been a new experience for all of us, but I think we've come through unscathed, and I hope you've been able to hear and see everything clearly from wherever you are tuning in from today. Finally, just to say a huge thank you to all our delegates. Thank you for joining us. SCoTENS has been around since 2003. Every year we have an annual conference. We've had to go online for the last couple of years. We very much hope that this will be the last hybrid or virtual conference, and we really look forward to meeting you again face-to-face, to enjoying some time together at a face-to-face conference, hopefully next year. I know we said that last year as well, but hopefully next year we'll see each other face-to-face, and we look forward to that. But for now, thank you for joining this unique cross-border network that is SCoTENS, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.